So I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible, but there's a lot of things to be covered, right? First thing is that the exam is posted, the midterm exam, so that should be, well, it is accessible. So you should go on there and begin as quickly as possible because that's not the only thing that we have this week, right? So this is week 8, and in addition to the midterm, we're going to be looking at the Colombian exchange and the Neo-Colombian exchange. So basically, we're looking at the makings of the modern Caribbean society, and we're looking at the beginnings of globalization in the Americas. Okay, so the Caribbean is really the first area of the world to be fully globalized in that sense. Okay, so um, week 8, and that's the issues that we're looking at this week. Sorry for the misspelling. I made a typographical error here. Columbian Exchange should be Columbian, but just for now, let's just leave it. If the other sections of the slide are fine. So the Columbian Exchange is that conjunction of exchange between Europe and Asia and Africa on the one hand, and the Americas on the other hand. So, as you can see from the arrows, these goods, people, and diseases were introduced to the different hemispheres with the advent of the European contact, beginning with Columbus. Um, I don't want to go into great details about the Colombian exchange because I know many of you may have actually gotten this from high school, but just as a refresher, right? So this is just a refresher. Um, and there's a video that is attached to week 8 that gives you a brief summary so that it's placed in context, so that when we look at the Neo-Colombian exchange, you get a sense of what that means, right? Neo, it means new. So this is going to be on steroids when we get to the Neo-Colombian exchange. So the essential question this week is, how does the impact of colonialism and slavery influence the creolization of Caribbean culture? So creolization basically means the cultural assimilation of the people of the Americas that result from the admixture of cultures that took place with uh, enslavement and colonialism. Okay, so last week the we looked at the linguistic uh, legacy of that contact. Okay, so many people were colonized by different um, imperial powers: the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the English, um, and the Portuguese, essentially, in the Americas. But there are others, Swedish, as in the case of Saint Eustachius, and the Danes, in the case of the Virgin Islands. But that ended in 1917 with the purchase of those islands. So there are many different admixtures to be looked at, and your various groups will have various expressions of that. Okay, your working groups. Okay, so that's what creolization really entails. So when we look at the Neo-Columbian exchange, we're looking at what is considered to be the second conquest of the Greater Caribbean. So now, this concept of the Greater Caribbean is one that we should take note of. We first encountered this term in the early readings, right? The Boswell reading in week 1, when he spoke about the Greater Caribbean. It should not be confused with the Greater Antilles. The Greater Caribbean entails an appreciation of the Caribbean as the islands as well as the mainland territories that are washed by the Caribbean Sea. And so you have the rimland countries, for example, so that, countries like Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, or the Guyanas, right, which includes the French, Dutch, and Spanish-speaking Guyanas, right, so Suriname and so on, right, and all of the islands. And so this is what the Greater Caribbean entails. So this concept of the Columbian Exchange looks at how this has happened. Okay, so the concept was first used by Alfred W. Crosby in his environmental history book, The Columbian Exchange. And so this term is now used fairly widely by economists and historians and so on. So this is what we're looking at. And so, the basic premise of this text that we're going to be looking at this week by this writer is essentially how the Caribbean became part of this global globalization. So the basic premise of the passage is that the landscape of the Greater Caribbean have gone through a process of major ecological globalization since the arrival of European explorers and settlers in the 15th century, so the 1400s, late 1400s, when Columbus first made his mistaken arrival. So the character of this globalization has changed over time, and capitalist mode of commodity-led economic development drove the Neo-Columbian exchange of the 19th century. And so this is what we're looking at today. Now, when we talk about the exchange of these different elements, we're not just talking about the goods, right, in terms of things that we use, but also what I consider to be the bads in terms of diseases and wars and things of the sort. So goods and bads. One of the things that we should really reference in this particular juncture of our journey in Caribbean studies is the fact that we're now in this global pandemic, which is a result of globalization. And this is a result. This is one of the more recent expressions of this, because this has happened before. Now, in the early to late 1700s, you had this huge problem of smallpox in the Americas, but particularly in Boston. It was introduced by Caribbean enslaved people that were brought to Boston to work. And it wasn't their fault, but it just happens that it was ravaging the Caribbean plantations, and they were brought to the United States, to what was then the 13 colonies, Boston in particular, and to work. And this was really wreaking havoc on the plantation. The house where the Caribbean migrants or the Caribbean enslaved people that were brought to the Americas, to Boston, were housed was labeled in red, so you should not go there. Other slaves, enslaved people, and other people should not make contact with these people. It just so happened that a shipload of Africans came to Boston at that time, and one of the enslaved persons saw the condition of the smallpox infestation, and he said, "Oh, I've had this in Africa," and it was solved. I mean, I was healed. I had it and I never had it again. So the slave master, who was sort of like someone who was a scientist of sorts, got very interested in this claim, and he said, why don't let's see what you got. Let's see if this is real. So he said, what we did in Africa is that the pus of the people that were suffering from smallpox was used to introduce into the womb of somebody that has smallpox. So you would use the pus from the smallpox and introduce it to someone through like a wound, like some kind of cut on the skin, and this will prevent you from getting the smallpox in the future. Guess what? This is the beginnings of vaccines. Like today, we have this pandemic, the coronavirus, and one of the things that is used is that some aspect of the virus is used not just with the coronavirus, but other viruses too, yeah, like the flu and so on, the common flu, um, is used to inject um, the, the, um, the patient, and that makes them, it inoculates them from the disease in the future. Anyway, didn't want to go into this into long detail, but I thought that was very interesting. And I posted an article on this smallpox issue, and the fact that an enslaved person was the person to have actually introduced this idea of a vaccine, or the beginnings of a vaccine. And that's one of the things about the exchange too. The exchange introduced not just things and uh, people, but also ideas, right? And so this is how globalization has impacted and continues to impact the world. All right. So one of the thing about globalization and the Columbian Exchange is that new species were introduced. Animal species, bird species, plant species were introduced to this side of the world that weren't here before. So the imperialist countries, the empires, uh, invested in this kind of enterprise. So you had, for example, the British Botanical Garden at Kew in England had this, really interesting lab where they did plant transfers, and the French Empire did similar in places like Mauritius and the Indian Ocean, but also Guadeloupe and Martinique, and nutmeg and cinnamon and such things that were from the East Indies, Moluccas in particular, were brought to the uh, the Caribbean, places like Grenada and so on, these islands became the Spice Island of the East, it is called, of the West, sorry, because the plant came from the East. So the geographic scope of the exchange evolved, and eventually we saw these plants becoming like sugarcane, for example, becoming like really very important commodities here and so on. But it also was a major change in terms of the diseases, the pathogens from Asia and the Pacific that came to these parts, right? We know that, for example, many Native Americans, many Caribbean Tainos and Calinados died um, from diseases, European diseases, right? So in addition to the wars, the diseases were introduced, sometimes purposefully and sometimes just by virtue of the fact that people are just moving from one place where there was uh, certain diseases and to another place where they had no defense for those because it wasn't there before. So the Neo-Columbian Exchange drove the region's dramatic expansion in agricultural production, but this constructed imbalance came at the expense of ecological impoverishment and fragility and the diseases that I spoke of before. So Cuba had its experiments with the Spanish in Cienfuegos. So the United Fruit Company of the United States in Honduras and so on. So in the Great Antilles, this was one of the areas where the impact was greater felt. Innovations in technology also help speed the introduction of new organisms in the Greater Caribbean. The transportation revolution of the 19th century is the most obvious. So you had steamships and things of the sort that plied the larger territories like Venezuela, Costa Rica, Panama, and so on. But Cuba, and to a lesser extent, Hispaniola, in terms of the actual the Greater Antilles. But the islands were so small that much of this, trans um, trans country shipment that took place in the Amazon and places like that did not impact the Caribbean in that same way. But one of the major change was the introduction of these steamboats, right, which made transport really, really, accelerate. So, like for example, while it would have taken weeks upon weeks to travel from Europe and Africa to the Caribbean, it now took days. So that has great implications. So you can actually bring plans. People can be traveling and be shifted from one region to another without having to go through the kind of rigors um, that were experienced before, right? So the introduction of river streamers, river steamers actually, in the 19th century, railroad opened up interiors of larger islands in the mainland to contact with the outside world, which is what I said before. So you all of this is your notes, and um, this period that we're in now, we've actually past the halfway mark of the class, so we're going to be relying a lot on notes and quizzes and the hypothesis application for note taking and for close reading and viewing using um, prompts, question prompts for the viewing of videos and things like that. And this is how you will be assessed along the way. But also, while I'm at this, I should just say that we should begin thinking about the final paper, right? So more than half of the course is already gone. So we want to make sure that we are in preparation mode for the final paper. And I will have a separate post on that, and I will give you some suggested topics. So these are some of the examples of how this really developed in our area, and in particular Cuba and other areas of the Greater Antilles. As I said, you will have these notes, and you'll be able to take notes. And these will also be areas where you can develop your final paper as well. In addition to the movement of goods and the diseases, which I kind of jokingly call the bads, uh, people were exchanged. So you had this huge influx of East Indian people, particularly people from the Indian subcontinent and from China, to the Caribbean, so that you have thousands of East Indians now living, hundreds of thousands actually, in places like Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Cuba, and even places like Haiti and Dominican Republic. Large numbers of East Indians were introduced. In the case of the Eastern Caribbean and Jamaica, they were introduced by the British. The British controlled huge swaths of uh, Asia at the time of that particular period of the Columbian Exchange. So since they controlled India, and India had a huge population, they're able to use people from that particular colony, and had this scheme that was developed called indentured servitude. So these people were actually introduced to the Caribbean in this way. We'll get into this in greater detail next week. But between 1838 and 1924, approximately 700,000, like almost three-quarters of a million of these people migrated from Asia to the Caribbean. So 500,000 of these, more than 500,000 of these, came to the so-called British West Indies. As I said before, Jamaica, Grenada, Trinidad, uh, Guyana, and so on. The majority came from India, about 80%, and some came from China and Java. Okay? So we already went over this concept of the Greater Antilles, the Greater Caribbean. What does that mean? And the old world means basically Europe, Asia, and Africa. So basically, the Columbian Exchange was the exchange of goods and services from the old world to the new world. So the new world is the Greater Caribbean, the Americas in general. And mercantilism is something we'll look at separately in this uh, as we proceed. So there's no need to get into it in great details here. But this is basically the structure of the Spanish colonies, and it was very similar in the French, Spanish, and I mean the French, British, and Dutch and Portuguese territories. So the Peninsulares at the top, and these are the fewer people. So they are at the top with the most power. And Peninsulares basically mean in the peninsula of the Iberian Peninsula. So basically Spain and Portugal. So Spain is not, Portugal is not mentioned here, but clearly this entails Portugal as well in terms of its colonization of Brazil, for example, which is a huge swath of land that was controlled and brought into slavery. And then the Creoles, basically Creoles, the people that were of that heritage, that Peninsularis heritage, or Europeans in general, and have basically, grew up in the Caribbean. And the Native Americans at the bottom, and people of African descent at the bottom, the least amount of power, but certainly not the least amount of people. So this is a little off in that particular regard. But a mixture of those are the mestizos and the mulattoes. You can look at this closer on your own. So the further notes on the Columbian Exchange is spoken of here, and you can look at it a bit closer. I'm moving right along because we're running out of time. So by the 17th century, France and the Netherlands began to, Great Britain and the Netherlands, establish plantation colonies in the Caribbean. Small islands such as Grenada and Barbados generated great wealth for the colonizers: coffee, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, nutmeg, and so on. In fact,